Okay, so welcome everyone, and my absolute honor to have Beena with me today, and we are going to talk about mostly explore the nuances of ethical AI and practical implications for businesses. So, but before that, I would like to start with a story that I heard recently. The story is about drunken elephant. Have you heard or seen any drunken elephant before? No? I haven't either. So you know that the elephants are herbivores. So they love tree barks, they love fruit, and they love bushes, and they eat grasses and so on. But when they find a fruit, if those fruits are fermented or overripe, so they like to eat more. And when they have those fermented kind of fruits they eat, they got tipsy. I didn't know that. So when they go out for an adventure and they found human settlement, they found fields of the farms and fields, and they destroyed them in the middle of the night. So the response to this one, so people and the farmers actually found a very human solution. So what they do is that they send their children out there in the middle of the night, and they across the field, and they ask them to watch elephants when they come, and with the whistles and headlights. And then those young children, they stay overnight, and then they go to sleep late at night, and then they go to school in the morning, and they fall asleep, unfortunately. So a group of young professionals found a solution for this one. So what they did is that they have a low-cost camera, and then they build an algorithm, and then they put that algorithm into those low-cost cameras, and those cameras doesn't need an internet connection, and that camera warns farmers when the elephant arrives, and then they warns, and then they create this early warning system. So this solution is quite low cost. It doesn't require so much of a big computers, or it's quite also a human and quite personal. So now these kind of cameras, it's been used around the fields for a long time, and it gives the farmers and farmers' kids mostly good night's sleep, right? So why did I start with this kind of story? So the reason why I start this kind of story is because, we've been seeing lots of discussions around the responsible AI and trustworthy and, the risk associated with the AI system. But we also need to talk about, the potential of these AI systems. Also, of course, we have to bear in mind that the ethics and all the issues, but we need to think about what are the potentials for those systems, what are the potential of these systems for humanity, and what are the potential of these systems for businesses. So today I would like to talk about what are those opportunities, so how we could see the balance between ethics in AI as well as the opportunities. So you wrote a book in 2022, Trustworthy AI. I would like to admit that I haven't finished it yet, but I will. So your book is about a business guideline for navigating trust and ethics in AI. So my first question is, I'd like to chat with you about what inspired you to write on this topic, and why do you think it's such a crucial subject, especially for businesses?
So my background is in computer science, and I started out my career as a programmer, SQL developer, and C developer, and so on. Have seen the whole evolution of data, right? And as Anna mentioned earlier, I've been in a variety of industries, media, manufacturing, telecom, field services, you name it, right? Banking, finance sector. And I realized that, as AI started becoming real, and I'll age myself here, but, I studied at a time, computer science at a time when AI was not real. It was more theory, and you could only visualize what might happen in the future, and seemed so futuristic that it didn't seem possible, right? And we are so fortunate we are living in that time when it's becoming real. And I started seeing AI, especially when, I think the big shift was when Hadoop came into the picture and big data became more accessible and compute was more accessible. So as that started becoming real, and I distinctly remember, when this technology started becoming real, then you see there are side effects for it, right? And there was a lot of conversation in the media, a lot of headlines around bias, how it discriminates against certain demographics, certain groups, and that is absolutely real. But I was also working at that, I remember at that time, I was working on predicting jet engine failure. And that was purely an IoT data. You're looking at black box data, service records, and bias was not really one of the key issues in that scenario when you're trying to predict failure so that you can prevent unplanned downtime, so your flight's are always on time, so on, right? And bias was not was not as big an issue or a side effect of it as reliability or new security vulnerabilities that might come when you start using software within a machine, right? So there were other issues that you needed to consider to get the full value from the technology. So that's when I started going down the path of thinking that, yes, bias is very important, but at the same time, there are other dimensions you need to consider. I'm a huge believer in the power of technology, and your story was so powerful, Sadaf. Thanks for sharing that. I think there's a lot of good AI can do. I'm going to admit that I'm a tech optimist. I do think that this technology is powerful and can do amazing things to improve all our lives. But at the same time, it comes with some risks, right? So how do we proactively address it? And we don't look at it, again, from a very narrow perspective. We look at it from a broader perspective to solve for those risks. And once you identify those risks, the reality is that you can actually start solving for it. Right? If you just focus on the headlines and the edge case scenarios, then you can't make progress. And I take the example of bias. There's a tangible way to address it. We all know, I'm assuming we all know that in this room, that it is impossible to have completely unbiased AI. That is not going to happen. If you're using human data, you have to worry about bias. The thing that you can do as stakeholders, as business leaders, is decide what's the accepted level of bias, right? And here's where that use case comes into play. And this is where my variety of experience in different industries brings that perspective. So the example I use is usually of facial recognition. We've all heard the example when facial recognition being used in a law enforcement scenario where you're tagging somebody as a criminal, right? And there's going to be bias, and it's completely unacceptable, right? In that case, you should not use that software at all because the risk is way too high. But that exact same technology, we were using in a factory floor to prevent worker accidents. If there was a factory floor worker whose eyes might have been drooping, or you saw some signs of fatigue, which could result in an accident, could you proactively do something, make a loud noise or stop, do some action to prevent that accident from happening to increase the safety? So in that case, even though the algorithm is not completely unbiased, what's the accepted level of bias? Is it okay if it reduces the number of accidents by 10%, 60%? At what point do you define it, and then you can track it and then make an informed decision on moving forward with it, right? The other extreme scenario where I've used that exact same technology being used is at traffic lights to identify human trafficking and kidnapping victims, right? Very similar to the law enforcement scenario, right? Used in the streets to tag these victims and then rescue them. In that case, the stakeholders have to make the decision, what's the accepted level of bias? Are we able to rescue 50% more victims than we could if we just relied on human identification? And is that okay? So making informed decisions, having this discussion is what will help us use the technology to its true potential while addressing and mitigating the risk. So the idea for the book was to talk about these different dimensions on how to proactively identify them and how to measure, track, and then implement them.
That's great. Thank you so much, Beena. This is really fascinating to learn about your motivation. And again, I really like your idea of not looking only at one dimension, but also other dimensions. Again, measuring those a different dimension and different implication is important, not only the businesses, but also societies as well. So one of the key themes, not one, but the majority of the talk that you're having in your book is ethical implications of AI development and deployment. And when we deployed in large-scale models and AI systems, so the risk increases. And there are a series of consequences for the society and for more serious consequences for the companies who develop and deploy those kind of systems.
Yeah.
So business might be, consequences might be like a lawsuit, consequences might be about reputation damage, and we see lots of recently, as well as a regulatory fines and so on. So when we see those AI innovations, so we know that the innovations are, advance our capabilities, right? In the meantime, the businesses need to align with their business values. They also align with their societal, the societal values as well. So you mentioned that you have experienced so many different sectors. So my question is, with this a balancing innovation and ethics, it could be a business ethics, it could be societal values as well. So what do you think about balancing, in this rapid pace of AI innovations with the ethical implication it brings along? And what do you see as the most significant challenges for the businesses? And what would you suggest for those companies who has this, see this challenge and the balancing of those two?
There's a lot to go there. So I'll try to address as much as I can, but we might need follow-up questions. So I think we have to move beyond the two things. We have to move beyond the era of build fast, fail fast. It just doesn't work, right? And we have to remove from our vocabularies the idea of unintended consequences. Oh, we didn't think about it. So so that's why there are more teen suicides happening because of the software that we built and rolled out to millions. I think the idea is to reduce unintended consequences. We have to get more responsible, and those are the businesses that's going to thrive. And most businesses, I like to classify it at a very high level, the pre-internet era business versus the post-internet, or the digitally native companies versus the non-digitally native. And if you see my background, it's mostly in that prior phase, right? Manufacturing and telecom and financial services. And those are highly regulated, highly, there are specific rules. But AI does bring in nuances, right? And we absolutely have to adopt AI, especially generative AI in the phase that's come in. I think the biggest risk with AI is not using it, right? You're going to be left behind from a competitive perspective. So there is no way going around it. So how do you go about it in a responsible, ethical way is the only path forward. Where there are laws that exist, being compliant is easy, but these technologies bring in nuances that haven't existed for, say, when you were doing an ERP implementation or when you were bringing in an ERP software, right? The biggest nuance is around fairness, transparency, explainability. These are forms of digital technologies which are bringing in these ethical nuances, and your business values have to consider for it. A few things to do around it is having AI-specific policies. When and how can employees use the certain software? Is it an internal LLM or tool that's available versus an external LLM? Having specific guidelines on an operationalization perspective, developing the policies, but more importantly, training every employee on the policies and about the risks. For example, it's not just your data science team or your compliance team or your IT team that needs to know about the risks of AI. It's that marketing junior level marketing person who might be looking at a vendor software for personalized marketing, which uses AI, who should be empowered to ask the right questions. Doesn't mean that that employee can answer the questions or will have all the answers, but knows enough to ask the right questions if there is bias within that software, and knows who to go to within your organization to escalate it. So embedding it in your existing ethical or compliance processes is the easiest way to make progress and balance that innovation you want to have along with addressing the risks.
That's a great point. So thank you for sharing, especially, the training, not only IT people, not only technical people, but also all the other business lines like HR or marketing and all these. They need to use like a same language. They need to know what's happening, what are the policies is about.
Yeah.
So this is very important. Thank you for sharing.
We make the mistake of thinking only IT or data science teams should care about ethics, but that's not true. It's every function in your organization. They might not be building the AI, right? But they are probably looking at acquiring an AI tool. And the reputational risks, the risks are going to be at the same level, whether you're building AI or using AI.
Yeah, that's true. You mentioned that organizations develop like methodologies, frameworks, or from like principles to like most of the practical solutions to ensure that AI system outcomes are fair, inclusive, like sustainable and non-discriminatory. And for example, UNESCO ethical impact assessment that was delivered, I guess, like recently, and then they're piloting many of the member states of actually private sectors are also using that assessment. And Vector Institute actually released the trust and safety principles for those who doesn't have those kind of principles, but they may use those principles, or for those who already have those principles, but they would like to advance it. So we have those for our partners and are publicly available on our system. So 2 days ago, actually, there was a Global Ethics AI Forum that was led by UNESCO in Slovenia. And there are lots of discussions. There are lots of academia, private sector, and the government. They were talking about AI ethics and governance. And the key message that I got from that forum is that let's go beyond principles. Let's do work, let's implement, let's move on from the principles to the practice. So this is like, really important. So I would like to dive into how to build the organizational awareness. So you talk about, training the different teams, but like I guess the organizations need to be more comfortable talking about this kind of, concept, ethics and bias and trust the system. Yeah. So in your book, you also mentioned about like extreme, examples. Like you also gave it some examples as well. So could you give us some like examples of what kind of barriers that some of the maybe businesses might have, when they're implementing those principles, or maybe moving on from the principles to actual implementations?
I think the biggest challenge is not necessarily from an organizational perspective as it is from a technology perspective. We all know the technology is still evolving. AI and Gen AI and the next wave of AI, it's coming, right? There's rapid developments happening in technology, and it's still nascent. It's still evolving. So think of it as a one path, and then there is a parallel path, is the risks that come with it. And there is massive amounts of research happening in investing in creating that next LLM, next wave of GPT, but not as much investment happening on the risk side, right, on the side effects that come with it. So there is this parallel path that organizations have to balance out. There is going to be tremendous pressure to use the AI while you have to figure out what are some of the risks you have to consider. A partnership that you do with a startup today who is working on the latest cutting edge LLM might be a risk in the future. So how do you prepare for that? A software that you build today or you acquire today, an AI software, tomorrow it might not be compliant when regulations come in. The third path is really the policies and regulations that will come, that is evolving at a much slower pace. So if you think of three parallel paths, the technology itself is evolving. The risks and side effects of it is evolving. And then there is the policies and regulations. And all of this have to be in tandem for an organization to be successful. So I think, from an organizational perspective, that mindset of how do you, stay in this constant learning and evolving phase, truly being agile, right? Being able to use new technologies, being able to quickly adapt it as new regulations or policies come in, or you learn about a new issue with the technology. How do you quickly now, have the foundation in place? And a few different things that come to mind of laying that foundation, right? One is around very clear on policy and guidelines. What is acceptable as an organization, what is not, right? And at what point will you roll back? Having that rollback plan will be very important from a policy perspective. Then learning and awareness. I've seen interesting things where the learning is not delivered just as a training program, right? It is more as a game, right? So you're constantly being able to introduce new concepts, and the employees are more engaged, and you can get points and gifts and so on, right? So gamifying the training itself to make this very philosophical kind of topic around ethics, converting it into a real business world. So you can put interesting training, which will have to be prepared to change. And then change your processes, right? Whether it's in your sourcing process, right, where you're acquiring a new AI tool, how do you make sure you're adding in checks where you are proactively checking for maybe copyright issues, what kind of data was trained on from a bias perspective, what kind of diversity of data existed that you're acquiring this marketing tool for, right? So sourcing, or whether it's in your the process your IT team uses to develop AI, right? So I think your fundamental processes have to be changed, have to be made robust enough to handle these 3 parallel paths that's coming at us. And we are just at the beginning of it. This is going to continue over the next 3 to 4 years. You're going to see more AI policies and regulations coming. Those principles becoming real, the Bill of Rights becoming real, and how do you actually make sure your company is compliant? And not only your company, but the vendors that you use, your partner ecosystem. How do you ensure all of them are compliant? What kind of groundwork can you lay today to make sure as this third path takes steam?
Yeah, those are great suggestions and great points that you made. So I appreciate that, and hopefully, some of the audience will make a note of those, so then they can use it afterwards. So one of your early interviews, you mentioned that there's lots of noise on AI ethics and trust, and it doesn't move us closer. It doesn't give us any consensus and clarify conversations how we keep trust in AI and corresponding to its power. So it's so hard that having a consensus about some of those discussions. And in order us to have an inclusive outcome of those AI systems, I think that we should have an inclusive conversation. So do you have any thoughts on this, like how we start those kind of conversations? And especially, we don't have a consensus on the taxonomy. So that I feel that, people are talking about, in different venues and, different companies, but we don't have actual consensus of any of these, like a taxonomy. So I think that, what are your thoughts about this challenge and how we could be more clear about when we talk about those concepts?
So we, as a collective room, as a collective whole, don't need to have a common taxonomy at this point. We can do things today at our individual organizational level. So focus on, the area that you have control over or influence over, your organization. How are you making sure you have the right policies in place? Think of it as a form of self-regulating. If I might go back to that, 3-lane example, we are in the phase where, the car is being created. We have the wheels, the body, the engine, and it's helping us move from point A to point B faster. That's the car. The second lane is really around, where while that is still being developed, there are accidents happening. There are people dying or getting hit, injured, right? That's the risk path. And then third path is because we don't have the speed limits. We don't have the lanes. We don't even have the roads because we were on horse carriages, right? So we are building this third path. Eventually, we will get there, not as long as it took for the cars and the speed limits to come into play or the seat belts to come into play. But we, this generation, as a collective room, have to agree that there needs to be seat belts. We may not call it a seat belt. You might call it a belt on the seat. I might call it a seat belt. But I think that awareness exists. I don't think the focus should be so much on the details of it as much as the agreement that if this, this technology cannot be used in certain ways, and then it is up to us. If you're a bank, then how does that mean? And all this is really mapping to is some form of self-regulation. Because this generation, our generation has this massive opportunity in front of us to creating those seat belts, the speed limits, laying the roads which future generations are going to use. I mean, I think that's a huge opportunity and responsibility for all of us to shape that third path, which is going to accelerate that first path, make the cars faster, electric, and even cooler.
Oh, that's great. So I like your analogy about the automobiles as well as an AI system. So thank you. And I guess we have a few minutes. So maybe I'll wrap it up with asking you, what will be the future trends? So how do you see, future is 6 months, maybe 3 months? Yeah. So how do you see this area?
I think on the first path, the technology evolution, given the massive amount of investment that's going on, you're going to see it moving at a much faster pace. You're going to see it every 3 months, 6 months. There's going to be new evolution, and you're like, what the heck? How do I keep up with this, right? So that there's going to be, and there will be pressure. We need to use this in our organization. You're going to hear it from all your leaders, right? And the second one is you're going to see in the headlines there is a new lawsuit, or there is a new issue that we found, or there was misuse. So it's important for you to be educated enough to say, does this apply in the use cases that we have in our organization? Maybe not, So okay, or maybe it does. Maybe it's a vendor that you're using. Maybe you need to do something about it. So, look at it from the lens that you have. It is very, very powerful, the lens that you hold. Don't try to solve for the whole world. Try to solve for the organization that you are in. That is powerful enough. And then the third one, which will be slower, so the second one will probably be, again, at a monthly pace. You'll see new headlines and new issues coming. And then the third one, which is really around policy regulations or seat belts and speed limits, that obviously is going to take longer because it's building roads. It's going to take long, right? So I think that one probably will be in years. But I do feel very optimistic that we're going to see progress in each of these. And the third path, which was much slower to start with, I think it is going to move faster now.
Oh, that's great, and I love your optimism. So thank you so much for sharing. And I hope audience who are in this room and an audience who are online, get this and optimistic role. And then, but of course, we have to think about all the risk. We have to think about building systems for businesses, building systems for humanity and society, and thinking about those values are important as well. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
I guess we have questions. Yes, so we can get a couple of questions from the audience if you have any out there. Or maybe in questions online, I'm not sure.
Hello? Okay, there's
Yes.
one online, if there's none in the audience. Okay.
Yes, please.
All right, the question is, how do you define trustworthiness in the context of AI, and what steps can organizations take to ensure that their AI systems are perceived as trustworthy by users and stakeholders?
So I have a few dimensions, and each one of these may not be applicable to your use case and your organization. One obviously is, fairness, and if there's any kind of human data involved, that is top of the list from a dimension perspective. And then there are dimensions like, the need for transparency, need for explainability. How explainable do you want your AI to be? And trust me, you do not want every AI to be explainable. Think of the scenario where, it's AI recommending your next song versus AI, doing a diagnosis on your illness, right? You want explainability and transparency in certain cases. In the other cases, it's not as important. Reliability and robustness. If you take a step back, nowadays we hear a lot around hallucination, but think about it. Hallucination is really a form of reliability, right? Your software is not providing consistent results. How important is reliability for you? Security and safety, data privacy. When data is being used for model training, and if privacy is important, how do you withdraw from it, right? So those are the few dimensions, off the top of my head that I think you should start with. And as you go deeper into it, you're going to realize, it's much more nuanced than just a checklist, right? So it's very important to make sure that, training, getting your people trained is the #1 thing. Not only about the basics of AI, but the risks of AI, so that everybody is empowered to use the technology, but at the same time, think about, some of the things that just don't work with it, right? The second is changing your processes, setting up an organizational culture by having, embedded checks within your processes for ethical AI or trustworthy AI. And the third is, if you already have AI tools that you've built or that you have acquired, you probably need to do some kind of a catch-up assessment to make sure they are falling within the new trustworthy dimensions that you've defined. So that's a starting point, but at least it'll reduce the number of unintended consequences.
Thank you so much, Beena. I really like the training and raising awareness. I guess training, and never stop learning, I guess. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, we have one, and a couple of them in the room.
Hi, thanks. So all of this stuff around AI trust and safety is becoming a conversation between academia, between industry, and jurisdictions around the world, government, right? And with so many voices, there's, in my mind, a risk that the conversation becomes fractured, that different jurisdictions make different decisions around what's important to them, what transparency means, what responsibility means, and as industry and academia sort of react to that, they may also have differing opinions. So how should we as a society navigate this entire space, navigate this global conversation around what we sort of commonly think of as trust and safety?
Yeah, no, the great question. And we are in this formation phase where there's a lot going on, right? A lot of churn and a lot of talks and a lot of conversations around this topic, right? And I think it's the formation phase, and there will be an evolution where we come to the point. But remember, it's I'm going to go back to the car example. There is no one single speed limit all over the world. So how can you expect one single AI rule, even if you look at an AI use case level? So I think it has to be for the innovation to continue, and for us to continue the use of this very powerful technology for good. I think you're going to see more nuanced policies come up. It will take time. One cohort you missed is, the NGOs or nonprofits who are very actively involved as well to make sure the broader societal impact is considered, the social good aspect is considered. I do think that we will see policies and regulation, and they may not be global actually. And they will definitely not be, a one-size-fits-all. It'll have to be industry, sector specific. It'll have to be, in some cases, even use case specific, right? It might be the same underlying technology, but how you use it in different scenarios is going to drive the best policy for that scenario. So we will see that happening. If I had to predict, right now in this formation phase, what we're going to see as the next phase will be where there are best practices coming from an industry or sector level, right? Best practices for using AI, and then the third phase will be where those will get solidified into regulations, but there will still be different speed limits depending on where you drive.
Thank you so much. I guess we have one more question here in the front row.
I think the greatest risk is assuming that, you know, it is like, it's an overarching risk. I don't think we are anywhere close to, you know, achieving AGI or that existential risk. The technology is just not there, right? Do we see it happening in the next 10, 20 years? Maybe, right? But I don't think we are there, right? But there are real risks today that need to be addressed and that we can honestly all address, right? We're all waiting for the regulations, so we are not seeing as much movement, but if we want to, we can honestly address some of the risks that exist today, whether it is, you know, discrimination or biases that creep into AI, whether it is, you know, mental health issues that's caused by AI platforms. There are issues that are happening today that need to be addressed before we go into this futuristic existential risk. So my take is, you know, focus on the risk today, because then you can actually solve for it.
Thank you so much again, and I guess our time is up. So thank you very much, everyone, for your questions, and thank you, Beena, for your great insights. And we're happy to have you here today. And yes, we have, I guess, afterwards we have a great panel. So I'm looking forward to see that panel discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you.